Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? As we look in history's rearview mirror, it is easy to forget that the United States spent 20 years in Vietnam. Billions of dollars were spent, and more than 50,000 Americans lost their lives. Like the Civil War, the Vietnam War tore the country apart. Many people are still angry and disillusioned. They are deep and inescapable psychological scars that still have not healed. My guest tonight was in Vietnam. He has agreed to share his story with us. Welcome to the show, Lieutenant Keeney. And for those of you just joining us, we did a part one in which we got an overview of Lieutenant Keeney and his background, his family, the things that shaped his life, the things that shaped him as a young boy, the things that shaped him as a man, the things that shaped him as a human being. In part two of this show, which is right now, we're going to talk about his experiences in Vietnam. We're going to talk about where he was in Vietnam, when he got there, how he left, and what impressions he had of the war. We're going to talk about the media tonight and what we think the media's view was of Vietnam and how that shaped Americans back home. He's been very, very gracious and forthright in talking about his feelings coming back home. Unlike our World War II veterans, when he came home, he received a totally different reception. Lieutenant Keeney, when did you arrive in Vietnam?
Actually, August of '68, the period of time for which I received the Bronze Star was October through the following August. But I arrived in August of '68.
Where did you land in Vietnam?
Landed in Bien Hoa. We flew in on TWA, Trans World Airlines, which is now a part of American Airlines, and we had our kits with our toothbrushes and all that kind of stuff. We flew in at night, and as we flew in, we could see in the distance firefights going on in different areas of the jungle. Of course, I'm thinking to myself, I've got a toothbrush here, and that's about all I have to defend myself. So I was hoping they wouldn't get too close to the airport.
Let's back up just a little bit, Lieutenant Keeney. Before you took off for Vietnam, I can imagine, as in millions of American families, there wasn't a great deal of joy that you were going to Vietnam. People were proud that you were serving your country, but I imagine your family was like many other families, not all that thrilled about you going there, being worried about what could happen to you physically.
Sure.
So set it up a little bit. What happened at home just before you left and how that played out?
Well, we had a dinner in my honor out at a nice restaurant in town, and a lot of my relatives came, and cousins and so forth, and it turned a little bit awkward because people wanted to chat with me and so forth, but some of them, I'm sure, felt maybe I wouldn't be coming back. So it was sort of a mixed kind of a feeling, and I had mixed feelings too. So it was nice that they would do that, but the actual dinner had a little misty-eyed, a few people a little misty-eyed.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, your father was gone. Your mother was still there.
Right.
Is your mother still with us?
She died in 2013.
Okay, we're sorry.
Yeah.
But your mother was there for your...
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
How was your mom that night? Can you look in your mom's face and tell me what you think your mom was thinking and feeling?
Well, she, of course, had the experience of her former boyfriend
being killed at
Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
So she was not anxious to have me served, and it would have been an easy process to have me not serve had she gone to the town draft board and so forth, the only surviving son and all that. But she didn't try to do that. She knew what I had in my heart, that I wanted to serve, that I wanted to do my part, so she just hoped that I'd return safely.
Now, Lieutenant Keeney, after that dinner that night and you were in the car driving home, what were your feelings?
Well, I was anxious to get started. really. I wanted to get my training in order and get over there and see what it was all about.
Okay.
I knew I would have experiences there that I would never have again.
All right. Yeah.
I had experiences in the Army that I wouldn't have again. 13 parachute jumps,
Yep.
the training and so forth, military intelligence, infantry officer basic, all of those kinds of things that I wouldn't really have again. I was looking upon it as a new experience, and I would do the best I possibly could and then move on from that. I had no aspirations to be a career Army officer. I just wanted to do my part.
Okay.
Really.
All right. So the morning arrives for you to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you that morning when your eyes open unto the world?
Well, I'm ready to go to Bradley.
No, I mean you're at your mother's home.
At my mother's home, sure.
Okay. So that morning
Right.
you were ready to leave. You woke up in your own home.
Right,
And you were leaving from your home to go to Bradley Airport
to fly out to California.
to fly out to California. All right.
Right.
Take us through it. Mom's at the door.
Mom's at the door.
All right. What happened?
And we drove out to Bradley. There was a sort of a long, a little bit teary goodbye. And that was it. I mean, this is 50 some odd years ago, so my ability to recount exactly what happened is not as good as it could have been, you know, if it had been just 20 years ago.
Sure, sure.
But we flew out to California. I began to chat with a few other of my, not friends, but associates that were going to be going through the same training. So we obviously had mixed emotions. We weren't quite sure what we were going to see over there. We had the benefit of Walter Cronkite having been over there. And he came back and said he didn't think the war was winnable, that he thought it would be fought to a stalemate. And he was the one that everybody trusted and everybody believed in. So he had that side of the equation to think about. That was his view on Vietnam. And he had heard about what happened at the Tet Offensive and so forth. And we knew basically what had happened, at least the U.S. version of what happened. And I found out other things when I came into country.
Okay, so you're in California. Where did you land in California? You remember the city?
I don't remember the city.
Okay.
It was in the San Francisco area.
San Francisco area. Right. What time did you get on the plane and start heading out for Vietnam?
Well, we flew not directly to Vietnam, but we flew to Hawaii.
Flew to Hawaii, okay.
And then boarded a different plane to go to Vietnam.
All right. And you flew into Vietnam at night?
At night.
All right. And you saw the firefights? And you had a toothbrush?
That was all I had.
Probably a Colgate toothbrush there, too.
Exactly. Colgate toothpaste and a toothbrush, right.
Did you have the packages from the Salvation Army that they gave? For the
Yeah, the regular kit.
Yeah, the regular kits.
We had that.
They were there
sure.
giving you that?
Giving us that,
Yeah.
sure.
That's an important piece because that let us know, a serviceman like you and me, when we were leaving the country like I did and you did, hey, this is home. This is what we do for our men and women in uniform. So I want to give a shout out to those people who still do that.
Exactly.
All right, so it's night and you're coming in and you land. And where do you go once you land? You scrambled off the aircraft?
Well, scrambled off the aircraft. Of course, I had all my training before heading over there.
Okay.
And my first duty assignment was briefing officer at the headquarters company, the 509th headquarters company. And of course, I knew next to nothing about Vietnam at that point in time. But luckily, and the briefings were all at 4:30 a.m. I wasn't a particularly good public speaker, and I bailed out of a public speaking course in college only to find out that, okay, now I was going to be briefing officer. And my first day, 4:30 in the morning, everybody was seated, and then three generals, they asked people to snap to attention. Three generals walked in and sat about 5 feet in front of me. And I keyed off the morning briefing, and you had to do it right. So I did the best I could, and when they asked a question that I couldn't answer, we would key in on a specialist for that particular area of Vietnam. And they were very well trained. They had been in country for, in some cases, 6 months to a year. So I did that for just really about 3 or 4 weeks, and then I was assigned to platoon, and that was down in the Mekong Delta. So that was the lower part of Vietnam.
So you went to the Mekong Delta.
Yeah.
Okay.
And our job, and it was a classified job dealing with communications,
Yeah.
but our job was to support what they called the MACV advisory teams, which is Military Assistance Command Vietnam. So those are the Americans that were helping to train the Vietnamese regulars to fight, as well as the Special Forces units that were around in that area. And we would rotate out to each of these units and then come back in, pull maintenance on our equipment, and then go back out again. So we were in and out of warfare because the maintenance area was pretty safe, but going out to some of these other units wasn't. So
Now, your unit came under fire, did it not?
it came under night attack.
Night attack.
At one Special Forces location, and they mortared us for several minutes, and there was small arms fire, and of course, even though with the Special Forces A team, you don't have a lot of Americans in that type of a unit.
Yeah.
You got some concertina wire, some Claymore mines, and that's about it, plus gunship support. So you call in the gunship support, they send rockets into these caves, which there's a network of caves. They would fire some mortars and then back into the caves to try to get back there before we return fire. So there was a lot of that and a lot of night attacks. And certainly we had some foxholes that we would get out from under our tents and head into the foxhole and try to regroup there.
Were you ever in fear for your life?
That particular night with the night attack, because one round landed so close that the top part of my tent was shredded. So that was a bit scary, yeah.
Now, Lieutenant Keeney, when you landed in Vietnam, you had a view based on American television, newspapers, we'll just say the media. Okay, that's one view that you had from people around you and all of that. And it's like you said, when you landed, Americans have to remember that Vietnam was 8,000 miles from America.
Sure.
And most Americans couldn't even pronounce Vietnam, to say nothing of why are we there and what our interests are and all of that stuff. But you definitely had a view that was shaped over a period of years about Vietnam. Okay, how is that view different than the view you developed after being in Vietnam? Was it realistic? Was it not realistic? What changed, or did it change?
Well, that war was a confusing war, I think, for a lot of people. Some people chose to go to Canada. Other people chose to directly get involved. And as I mentioned to you in our other discussion, you don't really get a chance to pick which war you fight in. All you get a chance to do is to serve your country, and wherever they send you, that's where you are, and that you try to do the best you can there. You know, there were theories about why we were in Vietnam. Was it a domino theory that if one country fell, then the other countries would fall to communism as well?
That was under President Eisenhower.
Sure.
The domino theory.
That was one theory. Another theory was they were going to fight the war. We were just going to send advisors over there to try to help them gear up to be able to fight the war. And neither one of those really was true in the long run. We were there, and we did a majority of the fighting. Certainly the Vietnamese were fighting too for their freedom and to lead a better life, but we were there in large numbers to try to help. The other thing that I found a little bit disillusioning was the war was being fought a lot of times on TV, and generals would have to get their orders from the States before they would necessarily do some of the things they needed to do. And that was not a way that typically in the past we had fought war. You'd give some authority to the generals who were right there in the field knowing what needs to be done.
In the theater.
In the theater.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not have it all filter back and forth and back and forth. So, you know, I was unhappy to hear that was going on. I was unhappy to hear about the Tet Offensive and what had happened there, and some people not being as active on duty as they should have been. And you hear rumors and all that kind of thing, so you don't know what is totally true and what isn't. But again, I had a job to do there. I tried to do that to the best of my ability, and I had a great platoon of guys who were really smart and really helpful. A large part of our job was to try to preserve American lives. And that put us in harm's way a lot of times, but that was really a large part of our job. So that's what I take solace in, the fact that we were able to help with some of that.
What did you think of the Vietnamese as the Viet Cong as adversaries?
The Viet Cong as adversaries, of course, they had been at war since the early 50s, and they were pretty good at it.
They'd been fighting the French since 1858.
Sure,
yes,
sure.
So,
and they had a certain network of tunnels. They had a lot of improvised explosives, a lot of things that they did. Put cow dung on stakes, and so if you fell into a pit, chances are you'd get creamed by one of these stakes and you'd have an infection.
Poisoned, yeah.
Poisoned. So things like that were happening. But again, you didn't have time too much really to think about some of these other things. You just had to do what you were responsible for doing and take the rest in stride.
Now, I've read about Vietnam and I've watched many documentaries, and I learned that a lot of our upper generals in Vietnam came with World War II experience, that they brought a stand-up, face your enemy, fight your enemy sort of attitude from World War II. We meet on the battlefield, you kick our butts or we kick your butts, we call a truce, we back up, we remove the dead and the wounded, and we come back at it. Vietnam was a guerrilla experience in a country that was heavily foliaged, and apparently you didn't see the enemy a lot. And because the people were ethnic, and they wore no uniforms, you never knew who the enemy was. Would you concur with that?
Well, you had the Vietnam regulars who were more organized and so forth and more difficult to deal with. But the Viet Cong could blend in with the villagers. And I had a couple of friends that got killed because a couple of villagers were Viet Cong. And the shanty that they stayed in, there was an explosive that was put in one corner of that shanty and triggered by trip wires, and the individuals were killed. So you didn't know exactly who was on your side and who wasn't.
That must be very unsettling.
Right, it definitely was.
Yeah, that can't be a good feeling when you look at somebody and they're ostensibly supposed to be helping you, but what they really want to do is take you out.
Yeah,
that's an amazing,
Fortunately, I didn't run into a lot of those type people, but there were a number of them over there as part of the villagers, and that made it tough.
Let's talk about the media.
Okay.
All right. What was your view? What role did the media play in shaping the view of Americans back home about Vietnam? Was it an accurate role? Was it a good role? What are your feelings about that?
Well, again, as I said before, it was a confusing war. As you say, it needed to be fought in a guerrilla fashion, and it was fought to a large extent. I think that might have been one of the first wars that was fought on television, where you had up-to-the-minute information about what was happening.
Yes.
So that was good, but it was also bad because some things that perhaps should have been kept a little bit more secret were not. So it made it more difficult for people fighting that war. It was hard to form an opinion. Looking back, certainly, I was a bit disillusioned by it, certainly.
By what disillusioned you? The media's representation?
The media's representation, but just in general, what was happening. Typically, you had a battle plan in most wars that I was aware of.
Yes.
You had a battle plan, you had things that you wanted to accomplish, and so forth. And this, really, you were relying on politicians to some degree to tell you what your next move could or could not be. And
Sort of like insurance companies telling doctors what they can do with the patients.
yeah, exactly. And that didn't sit well with me, but again, I tried to do my part and follow orders. And
It's the Constitution.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So,
The president is in charge.
yeah, that's right. And so that's kind of how it was treated. And I was very fortunate to have a good platoon of guys to work
Yes,
with, and
yes.
and they were fantastic. We did a good job with the units that we supported.
Lieutenant Keeney, did we win or did we lose in Vietnam?
We
United
fought-
States.
Cronkite was right. We fought to a stalemate. We really couldn't win that type of a war. It was a war of attrition, essentially. And, you know, you saw the pictures of helicopters picking up the last to leave, and it was not a happy ending. We felt we did a good job when we were over there, and then things began to fall apart. I left in August of '69, and things began to fall apart.
Where were you when My Lai happened? Do you remember?
I was, what was the date on that?
I'm not exactly sure either. I wrote
Yeah.
it down and left it, but it was Lieutenant Calley and My Lai. I
Yeah,
think it came
right.
out in the early 70s. I think
Yeah.
is when it came out. It happened, I think, in the late 60s. It
Late-
came out in the
yeah, I didn't hear about that until after I was
Until you were
home.
out of, okay,
Yeah.
you were back home.
Yeah, and obviously that was a tragedy.
Were you angry? Were you angry, Lieutenant Keeney, being in Vietnam? Did you get angry being an American, seeing the way the war was being fought, seeing the way you were being portrayed?
I was very disappointed. I don't think I was subject to PTSD. You know, sometimes it can promote a rage, but for me it was just very disappointing. It was disappointing to return and not have that be supported by the American people. It really wasn't supported, and I can certainly understand their viewpoint. I'm very good at being able to understand that. And it was only, you know, quite a few years later when a good friend of mine said, "Geez, Norm, why don't you march in the Memorial Day Parade with me?" And it took him 2 years to get me to do that. But in doing that, I asked a couple of friends of mine who also served in Vietnam in a different unit, so I didn't know them over there, but they also marched with me, and there were tears in their eyes because everybody was saying, "Thanks for your service." They saw the Vietnam ribbon, and it didn't matter where you fought, they thanked you for your service. And I needed that, and I think they needed that too.
And when did you come back home, Lieutenant Keeney?
It was March of 1970, because I was still serving at Fort Bragg as
Okay.
headquarters company commander.
Okay.
But March of '70, I came home, had about a week off, and then went to work for Connecticut General.
Okay, and in 1970 you came home.
Right.
And how long was it before you could bring yourself to participate in a military parade?
Well, I wasn't interested in doing that, so it was really many years later. It wasn't until the '90s that I did that.
Lieutenant Keeney, should we have been in Vietnam, the United States?
With the wisdom that we had at that time and the knowledge that we had at that time, I would say it's a toss-up. I think we know better now. I like the Ronald Reagan model better, that we're a shining city on the hill, and we're an example for others to follow. If other countries want to do that, it's probably our obligation to help to some degree, but also our allies' obligation to try to help as well, because we can help people best by showing the example, allowing them to come to our country and to assist to continue to make it a great country. So I think the Ronald Reagan model is a better model.
You've said that your mother was the most positive person you ever met, that she impacted you in ways that you still haven't gotten over. What did you mean by that?
Well, when my dad died, his hobby was woodworking and so forth.
Yes.
And And she was an artist, and she hadn't touched any kind of woodworking equipment at all up to
Yes.
that point in time.
Yes.
She had the choice of either selling that or learning how to use it, and she felt she would learn how to use it. And she was one of the better carpenters I've ever seen. She would crank out rocking horses, she would crank out footstools, bulletin boards for my family and for our relatives, some cousins and so forth,
Sure.
some of which they still have today. We go to Christmas parties in our small town and talk about some of these old times that happened. And when things were a little tough, she taught us a prayer that I might be able to remember, if you want me to
Please,
say it.
please.
This comes from her Christian Science background
Sure,
before.
please.
But God is my health, I cannot be sick. God is my strength, unfailing quick. God is my all, I know no fear, since God and truth and love are here.
Lieutenant Keeney, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Being here.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have for tonight's show. I want to thank my very special guest, Lieutenant Norm Keeney. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, good night.